She had been passed over 7 times in a single night. 7 men. 7 slow, deliberate walks in the opposite direction. And Lenora Vale stood in the middle of Black Hollow's lamplit barn with sawdust on her boots and her father's debt hanging around her neck like a millstone, watching the last eligible man in the room choose the miller's daughter instead. The crowd didn't even try to hide their whispers. She was 26 years old, penniless, stubborn as stone, and apparently invisible to every man within 50 miles. Then the barn doors burst open, and everything changed. If you've ever been counted out before you even had a chance to try, stay with me. Don't forget to hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The marriage gathering at the Hollis barn happened every October, same as it always did, same as it probably always would, until the town of Black Hollow finally dried up and blew away into the Wyoming dust. It wasn't romantic. Nobody pretended it was. It was practical. A room full of people sizing each other up the way you'd size up livestock at a county fair, checking teeth and temperament and economic standing before making any decisions. The women stood along the east wall near the cider table. The men circulated. Families watched from the benches. Old Reverend Cass sat in the corner and drank more cider than anyone. Lenora Vale had attended 8 of these gatherings now. She had been 16 the first time, dragged along by her mother before the consumption took her. Shy then, skinny, hair braided too tight because she'd done it herself. Nobody had approached her that year, but she hadn't expected them to. She was 16. There was time. There was always supposed to be time. Now she was 26, and she stood against the east wall in her best dress, which was not a particularly good dress, brown wool with a repaired hem she'd sewn herself, and she watched Martin Greeley walk past her for the second time that evening without making eye contact. He'd already spoken to Clara Fitch, Eloise Danner, and the Harmon widow twice. He would not be speaking to Lenora. She knew it. She just hadn't moved yet because moving felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. "You could try smiling more," said a voice beside her. She turned. Agnes Hollis, whose barn this was, whose husband had organized the event for the past 15 years. Agnes was 60-something and did not mean to be unkind. That almost made it worse. "I'm smiling," Lenore said. "You're doing the face you make when you're calculating something," Agnes said. "Men don't like that face." "What face do they like?" Agnes patted her arm. "Oh, honey." That was when Lenora understood it was going to be another long night. Mama. She had not always been poor. That was the thing people in Black Hollow forgot, or chose to forget, because it was more convenient to see her as simply what she was now. The daughter of Emmett Vale, who had drunk himself through 2 businesses and 3 properties, and was currently living in what used to be a storage shed behind the tanner's yard. She was Emmett Vale's daughter, which meant she came with complications. She came with his debts. She came with the reputation of a family that had unraveled slowly and publicly over the course of 15 years. Her mother had been different. Eleanor Vale, née Marsh, had been practical and steady and had held the household together with a kind of quiet ferocity for years before her lungs gave out. Lenora had her mother's jaw and her mother's stubbornness and very little else from either parent that anyone found useful at a marriage gathering. She could run a household. She knew it, even if nobody else did. She could keep accounts, mend harness leather, preserve enough food to last a full Wyoming winter, negotiate with suppliers, and work longer hours than most men in Black Hollow without complaint. She had been doing exactly that for years, first for her father, before he sold the last of it away, and then for various families around town who paid her in meals and small wages to manage their kitchens and their cellars and their books. She was competent in ways that didn't show up in a lamplit barn. That was the problem. By 8 o'clock, she had spoken to 4 men. The first was Thomas Bray, who had smiled at her pleasantly, and then explained that he was actually waiting for a chance to speak with Dorothy Kane, who was standing behind Lenora. Could she step to the side? The second was old Pete Merrick, who was 63, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and looking primarily for someone to cook for him. He had told her this directly, without any attempt at tact, and when she hadn't responded warmly, he'd moved on to the widow Samuels, who apparently had lower standards than Lenora when it came to candor. The third had been a young man she didn't know, somebody's cousin up from Laramie, who had talked to her for almost 10 minutes before his eyes started drifting to Eloise Danner's direction. He hadn't even bothered to finish his sentence before he excused himself. The fourth was Henry Callum, who was 34 and owned a dry goods shop and was, by most accounts, a decent man. He had looked at her directly, asked about her situation, meaning her father, meaning the debts, meaning everything that came with the Vale name, and she had told him the truth because she'd never been good at performing a version of herself that didn't exist. He had listened politely. He had thanked her for her honesty. He had gone and stood with the group around Clara Fitch, who was 17 and pretty, and whose father owned the only mill in the county. 7. By the end of the night, 7 men had found reasons to be somewhere that wasn't near Lenora Vale. She was considering leaving when the barn doors opened. It wasn't a quiet entrance. The doors didn't ease open the way they did when someone arrived late and embarrassed about it. They came in hard, letting in a blast of October air that made every candle and lantern in the room shudder at once, and the crowd near the entrance stepped back automatically, the way crowds do when something large and unfamiliar enters a space. The man who walked in was large. Not in a soft way. Large the way the mountains to the northwest were large. There was weight to him that wasn't just physical, something that came from existing in conditions that didn't allow for softness. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, maybe, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least 2 weeks. His coat was the kind you trapped in, heavy, worn in, smelling of wood smoke and pine pitch. He had a thin scar along his left cheekbone that caught the lamplight. He stood in the doorway for a moment and he looked around the room with dark eyes that moved the way a hunter's eyes move. Not rude, not aggressive, just taking in information, cataloging exits and occupants and threats out of habit. Someone near Lenora whispered the name, Draven Cade. She knew it. Everyone in Black Hollow knew it, even if most of them had never seen him. Draven Cade was the trapper who worked the high country above the timberline, the frozen stretch of mountain territory that serious men with good equipment still mostly avoided in winter. He came into town twice a year, traded his furs, restocked his supplies, and left before anyone could get too comfortable with his presence. He didn't socialize. He didn't attend events like this one. Agnes Hollis was already moving toward him with the specific energy of a woman who has organized a social gathering and will not allow unexpected variables to derail it. "Mr. Cade," she said, loud enough that several conversations stopped. "I didn't know you were planning to—" "I wasn't," he said. His voice was low, flat, not impolite, just economical. "I need to speak with Hollis about the North Access Trail. I saw lights." "Well, we're in the middle of—" "I can see that." He was already looking past her. Not at Clara Fitch, who was the obvious first choice by most available measures. Not at Eloise Danner, who smiled at him immediately and touched her hair. Not at Dorothy Kane or the widow Samuels or any of the women who had been circled twice and complimented and pursued for the last 2 hours. He was looking at Lenora. She didn't know what he saw. She genuinely didn't. She wasn't doing anything. She was standing against the wall in her repaired brown dress, with her arms crossed because she'd been cold since the doors opened, and she was thinking about whether she could leave without anyone commenting on it. He crossed the room. Not directly. He had to navigate around a knot of men near the center, and someone tried to stop him to shake hands, and he did shake hands, briefly, but his trajectory was unmistakable. People noticed. The whispers that started were a different quality than the ones from earlier in the evening. He stopped in front of her. Up close, he smelled like the mountains. That was the only way she could describe it later. Clean, cold air and wood smoke and something that might have been spruce sap. "You're Emmett Vale's daughter," he said. "I am." She held eye contact because she was not going to be the one to look away. That usually ends the conversation. Does it? 7 times tonight. Something crossed his face. Not pity. She would have left if it had been pity. It was closer to recognition, like she'd said something that landed in a register he understood. "Lenora," he said. Not a question. "That's right. You know my name. I know most things worth knowing about this town." He paused. He seemed to be deciding something, working it through with the same methodical deliberateness she imagined he applied to reading a trail or setting a trap line. "I need a partner for the winter season. Someone who can work, keep accounts, manage the supply inventory. My cabin is above the timberline. The work is hard and the conditions are worse." She stared at him. "I'm aware that this is not how these evenings usually go," he said. "No," she said. It's usually the man who finds reasons to leave. I'm not leaving. Why me? You walked past half a dozen women who would have said yes before you finished the sentence. I don't want someone who says yes before they've thought about it. He said it plainly, without ornament. I've heard you keep accounts for the merchant. I've heard you managed the Kane household through 2 bad winters before he decided he could afford someone younger and easier. I need competence, not performance. Lenora was quiet for a moment. Around them, the barn had gone to a kind of strained pretend normalcy where everyone was very obviously trying to conduct other conversations while listening to this one. You're talking about a working arrangement, she said carefully. I'm talking about a partnership, which is different from what most of the men in this room are offering. She thought about her father in his storage shed. She thought about the accounts she kept for other people's households while her own situation quietly collapsed. She thought about 8 October evenings against an east wall and the particular exhaustion of being evaluated and found wanting by people whose opinion she was not entirely sure she'd ever respected. I'd need to know more, she said. I'll tell you what you need to know. I'd need time to... I leave at first light, he said. Day after tomorrow. You can have until then to decide. She looked at him for a long moment. You rode in from the high country tonight, she said, 2 days before the cold front comes through. 3 days before, he said. How do you know about the front? I watch weather. I've been watching it for 20 years. She paused. The access trail you mentioned to Agnes, the north one, that's been washed out since August. Did Hollis tell you that? Something changed in his expression. Not dramatically. He wasn't the type for dramatic expressions. But something behind his eyes shifted, recalibrated. He didn't, he said. He probably didn't know. I keep accounts for the McAllister place on the northeast ridge. The washout took out a section of the trail and part of their fence line. Nobody's repaired it because nobody's used it since summer. She met his eyes. If you were planning to take that route back up, you'd want to go by the creek bed instead. It adds 2 hours, but it's passable. He was quiet for a moment. Day after tomorrow, he said. First light. If you decide to come, meet me at the east edge of town. Bring what you can carry. Everything else, we'll handle. Then he turned and walked toward the back of the barn where George Hollis was standing, and Lenora stood very still against the east wall, with her arms no longer crossed and her mind moving at a pace she hadn't felt in years. She went to see her father that evening. The storage shed behind the tanner's yard was worse than it had been in September. She could see that as soon as she pushed the door open and held up her lantern. The straw on the floor was damp. There was a bucket in the corner that she didn't look at too closely. Emmett Vale was awake, sitting on an overturned crate, and he looked up at her with the red-rimmed eyes of a man who had been drinking since mid-afternoon. Lenora, he said. Papa, how is the gathering? Educational, she said. She moved the lantern to a hook near the door and sat down on the small stool that was the shed's other furniture. I need to talk to you about something. He watched her with the careful attention of a man who knew he didn't have much standing left, and was therefore listening more carefully than he used to. She told him about Draven Cade. She told him plainly, without dressing it up or down, the way her mother had taught her to say difficult things, factually, completely, without apology for the facts themselves. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Cade, he said finally. I knew his family, before. His father was a straight man. I know. The high country. He looked at his hands. That's not easy country, Lenora. I know that too. You've never wintered above the timberline. I haven't, she paused. But I've survived every winter I've been given so far, and I've done it mostly by myself. He flinched. It was a small movement, but she saw it and was sorry for it even as she knew it was true. I'm not saying that to be cruel, she said. I'm saying it because it's the kind of thing I need you to believe before I can go. You've already decided, he said. I'm deciding now, in front of you. That's why I'm here. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she remembered from her childhood, before the drinking had become the primary thing. He'd done it when he was thinking hard. She had almost forgotten that. What about your debts? He said. They're your debts, Papa. They have your name on some of them. I know. She had calculated this already, sitting against the east wall of the Hollis barn while Draven Cade walked away. If I stay here, I'll spend the next 10 years paying them down at the rate I'm going, and that's if nothing else goes wrong. If I go up there and the arrangement works, I'll come back in spring with wages, real wages, enough to start clearing the principal. And if the arrangement doesn't work, then I'll be in the same position I'm in now. She looked around the shed, which is not a position worth protecting. He was quiet again. Then he said very quietly, "Your mother would have done the same thing, gone, when something that wasn't nothing presented itself." Lenora looked at her hands. "I'm going to come back," she said. "That's not an empty thing I'm saying to make you feel better. I'm coming back in spring because I have reasons to come back. I just need the winter to build something worth returning to." He nodded slowly. He was crying a little, or close to it, and he turned his head so she couldn't quite see. She stayed another hour. She helped him move the wet straw and replace it with the dry bundle she'd brought tied to her back. She checked the roof for the worst of the gaps and stuffed them with rags. She left him with enough coin for 2 weeks of meals and told him where to find more if he needed it. When she left, he said her name once, quietly, just as she reached the door. She turned. "Don't let them take the ridge," he said. He seemed to be speaking from somewhere far away, from some older version of himself that still knew what that meant. "The mountain land, it matters. I don't know why I know that, but I know it." She didn't know what he meant. Not yet. "I'll be careful," she said. She walked back through Black Hollow under a sky thick with stars going cold. The Hollis barn was dark. The gathering was over. The streets were empty except for a dog and a single lantern moving on the far side of the tannery. She went home and she packed. There wasn't much to pack. That was the most clarifying thing about her situation, she'd found. The absolute lack of excess made every decision simple. She had her heavy coat and her mother's wool blanket and 2 changes of clothing and her good boots and her knife and a small tin box where she kept her account books and a leather pouch with what coins she had. She sat up most of the night going through the books. Not her own. There wasn't much to review there, but the accounts she kept for the 3 households she managed. The Merchants, the McAllisters, the Brody family on the South End. She made clean copies of everything, marked where each account stood, noted upcoming expenses and seasonal obligations. In the morning, she would deliver these copies to each family so they could find someone else before the next supply order was due. She sat at her small table in the single room she rented above the harness maker's shop, with her candle burning low and the Wyoming night pressing against the window. And she wrote careful notes to 3 families explaining that she was leaving and why, and that she was sorry for the inconvenience of the timing, and that their accounts were in order. It was decent of her. She knew it was decent of her. She also knew that none of them would see it that way. They would see inconvenience, and inconvenience alone. She didn't write a note about Draven Cade. There was no explanation she could write for the town's consumption that would make the decision legible to them. He had asked. She had said yes. She was going. Around 2 a.m, she closed the account books and made herself lie down, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about wolves. Not metaphorically. Literally. There were wolves in the high country. She knew that. Wolf packs that worked the tree lines and came down sometimes in hard winters when prey was thin. She had never been close to a wolf. She was not entirely sure what she would do if she were. She was not going to think about it too much because thinking about it too much would not help, and she needed to sleep. She slept badly and woke before dawn, but he was already there when she reached the east edge of town in the gray pre-dawn cold. 2 horses, his and a loaded pack animal. He was checking the pack animal's cinch with practiced hands, not looking up when she approached. She had her pack on her back and her coat buttoned to the throat and her breath coming in small clouds. He looked up finally. He looked at her pack, calculating what she'd brought. She could see him doing it. And then he looked at her face and gave a single nod. "You figured out the North Trail situation for yourself?" she said. "Sent word to Hollis last night. He didn't know about the washout." "I told you he didn't." "You did." He handed her the reins of the second horse, a bay mare with a calm eye and 4 white stockings. "Her name is Belle. She's better than she looks." Lenora took the reins and looked at the mare, who looked back at her with the patient, faintly judgmental expression of an animal that has been around long enough to reserve opinion. "We'll see," Lenora said. She mounted up, not gracefully, but she got there, and she didn't need help. and she settled into the saddle and looked back at Black Hollow for what she somehow already knew would be the last time for a while. The town was still dark. One light in the bakery window. A rooster somewhere starting up. The general shape of the place she had lived her whole life, ordinary and closed and entirely indifferent to her departure. She turned the mare north. "Stay close," Draven said, his horse already moving. "The first pass is straightforward, but there's a section where the trail narrows. Don't let her drift left. There's a drop." "How far?" "About 30 feet." "Right," Lenora said. "Stay right." They rode in silence for a while, the hooves quiet in the dirt, the town falling away behind them, and the mountains rising ahead in the early light, dark and massive and permanent, indifferent in their own way, but differently indifferent. Indifferent the way large things simply are, rather than the way people choose to be. After about 20 minutes, Draven said, without looking at her, "You brought account books." It wasn't a question. She'd seen him clocking her pack in that first assessment. "I always have account books," she said. "Old habit." "Good habit." Another stretch of silence. The trail began to climb. "Cade," she said. "Yeah. Why do you actually need a partner this winter?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Last winter I got a fever in December. Laid up for 11 days. No one knew. No one would have known until spring." He paused. "That's a long time to be a problem nobody finds." She turned that over. "That's a practical answer," she said. "I'm a practical man." "Is that the whole answer?" He looked over at her then, briefly, with those dark, assessing eyes. "No," he said, "but it's the part that matters right now." She accepted that. She wasn't going to push. Not yet. They had a long winter ahead for truths to surface in their own time, and she'd learned from keeping other people's accounts that you understood a household's real situation slowly, by accumulation, not all at once at the front door. The trail steepened. The pines closed in on both sides, heavy and dark. The light was coming up properly now, pale gold through the eastern gap in the ranges, and it turned the frost on the pine needles briefly into something that looked precious and wasn't. She kept the mare right. She watched the trail. She matched his pace. She didn't look back at Black Hollow. On the second day they crossed the timberline. Everything changed above it. Not dramatically. It was a gradual shift, the trees thinning and then gone and then just rock and sky and wind that came without warning and went the same way. The temperature dropped by what felt like 10 degrees in an hour. The horses moved differently up here, more careful and deliberate, heads lower. She had known it would be harsh. She hadn't known it would be so completely itself, so utterly indifferent to any human expectations of comfort. There was no middle ground up here. Nothing was soft or accommodating. Every surface was either stone or frozen or both. She found it, and this surprised her, clarifying. She had spent years managing situations that were complicated by other people's feelings and performances and expectations. Up here, there was none of that. The mountain's demands were simple. Meet them or don't. There was no judgment in it, only consequence, that she could work with. "You're not complaining," Draven said, on the evening of the second day, when they had stopped to rest the horses and make a fire. "Nothing to complain about yet," she said, which was only half true. Her thighs ached from 2 days in the saddle, and she had a blister on her right heel that she was being careful not to think about. "Most people complain by now. Most people haven't been waiting for a situation they could actually affect." She held her hands near the small fire. "This at least gives me something to work with." He looked at her over the fire, steady, unreadable, in that way he had. "The cabin's 8 miles further," he said. "We'll reach it by midday tomorrow." "What's the supply situation?" "Good for 4 months, tight for 6. "Tight meaning what?" "Meaning we'd be rationing by March if the hunting's bad." She nodded, filing this away. "You have the accounts from last year?" "Written down somewhere." "I'll want to see them when we arrive." He almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but something in his face moved in that direction. "I had a feeling you'd say that," he said. "Good feeling to have," she said, "about the person you're trusting with your winter." The fire snapped. Somewhere out in the dark, something moved, a branch maybe, or something that walked on 4 legs. Neither of them flinched. She noticed that neither of them flinched. Overhead, the stars were extraordinary up here. No competition from any light below, just the full, brutal, gorgeous weight of all of them at once. She sat with her back straight and her face toward the fire, and her mind already working through inventory and supply calculations and the 8 miles between here and wherever she was going. Not lost. Something new. They reached the cabin the following morning, 2 hours before noon, when the sky was a pale and freezing blue, and the smoke from the chimney they'd left. Banked was still rising, thin and gray, over the ridge. It was smaller than she'd expected and more solid, built into the hillside on 3 sides, stone foundation, heavy timber walls, a roof that was designed to shed snow rather than just resist it. A workspace attached on the east side, the trapper's shed. She could smell it from 20 feet away. There was a spring nearby. She could hear it, still running barely, under a skim of ice. She stood in front of the cabin and looked at it and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not happiness exactly, and not hope exactly, but the particular sensation of standing at the place where the real thing starts. "It's not much," Draven said behind her. "It's enough," she said. She had meant it as a practical assessment, but he was quiet for a moment after she said it. And when she glanced back, he was looking at the cabin with an expression she couldn't read, something old and private in it. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She carried her pack inside. She hung her coat on the hook beside the door. She put her tin box of account books on the table near the window where there was the best light. Then she went to find the inventory records because they had 4 months until it got easy and 6 until it got dangerous. And she was not here to stand against a wall and wait to see who noticed her. She was here to work, and work was something Lenora Vale had never once in her life been afraid of. The first thing Lenora did after unpacking was find the inventory records. They were in a tin box under the workbench, written in Draven's hand, cramped, practical, not much care for neatness, but completely legible if you took the time. She spread them on the table near the window and spent an hour going through them while he tended to the horses and broke the ice off the spring. The picture they painted was not comfortable. He'd estimated 4 months of reasonable supply. Her read of the numbers put it closer to 3.5 if they were running at 2 people's consumption and doing the kind of physical work the trapline required. The dried meat stores were good. The grain was fine. It was the fat, rendered lard, cooking oil, the kind of dense caloric weight that kept a body warm when the temperature dropped to the kind of numbers that killed. That was thinner than she liked. She was still working through the figures when he came back inside, stomping snow off his boots. "Well," he said, because he'd already read her well enough to know she'd have an opinion, "we need to prioritize fat renders early. Whatever we trap in the first month that we're not keeping for fur, we render down before we do anything else." He pulled off his coat. "That's what I've been doing." "I know. I'm saying we do it more aggressively this year." She turned one of the pages toward him and pointed. "You went through your large stores fast in February both years I can see records for. February is when the temperature bottoms out. That's when you need it most, and that's when you've had least." He looked at the page. He looked at it with the careful attention of a man who was deciding whether to be annoyed or impressed, and she could see him working it through. "You got all that in an hour," he said. "I got all that in 40 minutes. I spent the rest of the time checking my math." He almost made that almost smile again. "All right, we render first." That was how it started. Not warmly, not easily. It started the way most working partnerships start, with 2 people who don't know each other well enough to trust, but smart enough to recognize competence, feeling their way forward through a combination of negotiation and mutual observation. He was not an easy man to work alongside. That became clear in the first week. He had routines built from years of solo living, and they were efficient routines, but they were completely his, and he hadn't thought about how another person would fit into them. He woke before dawn, which was fine. She woke before dawn too. He worked without talking for long stretches, which suited her. But he also made decisions without announcing them, simply moved into action on whatever the next task was. And she had to learn quickly to pay attention to where he was and what he was doing, or she'd find herself setting up to do something he'd already halfway done. "You need to tell me when you're changing the plan," she said, on the 4th day, after they'd nearly set the same set of traps twice from different ends of the line. "I didn't change the plan. You went to the east line first, we said north. The east line was more urgent, fresh tracks overnight." "Then say that. Say, east line first, there were tracks. That's 8 words. He looked at her steadily. I'm not used to explaining myself, he said. I understand that. You're going to have to get used to it. She held his gaze without flinching. I can't do the work if I don't know what the work is. That's not a personality problem, it's a logistics problem, and logistics is what you brought me up here for. A silence, the kind that could go badly or acceptably. East line first, he said. There were tracks. Thank you, she said, and meant it without sarcasm. He turned and walked toward the east line, and she followed, and that was more or less how that particular negotiation resolved. The trapline work was harder than she'd anticipated, and she had anticipated it being hard. The physical part was simply what it was, cold and demanding, requiring a particular combination of fine motor control and brute endurance that she'd never had to combine before. Setting a trap correctly required steady hands and precise positioning and the knowledge of how an animal moved through a specific type of terrain. She didn't have that knowledge. She had to build it from scratch, watching him, asking questions, making mistakes, and then making different mistakes. He was not a patient teacher in the conventional sense. He didn't explain things multiple times in multiple ways or offer encouragement when she got something wrong. He showed her once, watched her try it, corrected what needed correcting, and moved on. It was efficient. It was also occasionally maddening. The jaw's off center, he said, on her third attempt at setting a leg trap. I can see that. Then fix it. I'm fixing it. I'm telling you I can see it so you know I know. Knowing and fixing are different things. I'm aware, Cade. She fixed it. It took her another 3 attempts to get it consistent. By the end of the second week, she could set the standard traps reliably in frozen ground, and by the end of the third, she was doing it faster. She didn't tell him she was tracking her own improvement. She didn't need to. She could see from the way he stopped correcting certain things that he noticed. What she hadn't expected was how much she would come to understand the mountain itself. She had thought of it as backdrop, harsh and static. She hadn't understood that it was a system, constantly moving and shifting, readable if you knew the language. Draven had been reading it for years, and she discovered that he was, in this specific domain, a genuinely extraordinary teacher, not of technique, but of attention. He taught her to read snow, to understand what animal had crossed it, and how long ago and how fast and in what direction, and what that meant about where it was going and why. He taught her to read the sky, to understand which cloud formations meant what kind of weather, and how fast it was moving, and whether they had hours or days. She found that she was good at it. Not naturally good, she had no illusions about natural gifts, but good the way she'd always been good at things, by paying close attention and remembering everything. That formation, she said, 3 weeks in, pointing at a bank of cloud moving from the northwest. That's the one that came in ahead of the storm on the 8th, same shape, same direction. He stopped and looked. Yep. How much time? 8 hours, maybe 10. We should check the east traps and get back. That's what I was thinking. They went. What she had not expected to find, buried beneath the practical rhythms of the trap line and the inventory and the daily calculation of survival, was the man himself. It came out slowly. He was not the kind of person who offered information about himself. She'd gathered that immediately. But living in close quarters in brutal conditions has a way of eroding the kinds of performances people maintain in ordinary social life. There simply wasn't enough energy for them. By the end of a 12-hour day in sub-zero temperatures, people stopped being careful. She learned that he'd grown up in the mountain country further north, in a family that had worked this kind of land for 2 generations. His father had trapped and logged and known the high country the way Lenora was beginning to understand it, from the inside out, from the ground up, from accumulated years of close attention. There had been a brother, younger by 4 years. His name came up by accident. She mentioned a stretch of the eastern ridge she'd been wanting to check, and he went very still for a moment and then said quietly that that ridge was where Callum used to run his rabbit snares when they were boys. Callum, she said carefully. Your brother? Younger brother. He was quiet. He died 4 years ago. She didn't push. She waited. Over the next 2 weeks, in pieces, she got the shape of it. Callum Cade had been 22 when a man named Vernon Blackridge came through the territory with surveyors and legal language and the kind of money that tends to make official documents appear from unexpected directions. Blackridge had been interested in the ridge, a specific stretch of it, above the timberline on the southeast face, where Draven's family held established trapping rights going back decades. He had also been interested in what was under the ridge, though at the time neither Draven nor Callum had known what that was. Callum had refused to sign the surrender documents. Draven had been 3 days ride away at the time, working a trap circuit. By the time word reached him and he rode back, Callum was dead. A fall, the official account said. A section of trail that gave way. The section that gave way, Lenora said, the night he told her this. The two of them at the table with the lamp low. You looked at it? I looked at it. And? He turned his cup in his hands. He had long hands, scarred across the knuckles, careful with everything they touched. Sections of trail don't give way clean like that. Not the way they said it did. A real trail failure. You get debris, you get a pattern of collapse. What I found was clean. He paused. Too clean. She let the weight of that sit. And Blackridge, she said, left the territory 3 days after Callum died. The documents that showed up after, a new survey, new ownership claim on the ridge rights, they had Callum's signature on them. He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that was old and cold and completely controlled. Callum couldn't write. He never learned. Whatever signature was on those documents wasn't his. Lenora was quiet for a moment. You reported this. To who? The county official at the time was on Blackridge's payroll. The nearest federal office was 3 weeks' ride. He shook his head. By the time I could have gotten anyone to listen, the documents were filed and the claim was legal on paper. And I couldn't prove the trail wasn't an accident. I couldn't prove any of it. But you know. I know, he said, flat and final and without any drama in it, which was somehow more disturbing than anger would have been. She thought about her father's words the night she left Black Hollow. Don't let them take the ridge. She hadn't understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now. Not what he'd known specifically, because she doubted he'd known anything specifically, but what he'd felt the way people sometimes feel things in the bones of a place they've lived in long enough. The silver, she said. He looked at her. You said you didn't know what was under the ridge when Callum was alive, but you know now. A pause. Survey I got hold of, year after it happened. Blackridge had his own men do an assay on the southeast face. There's a seam, significant. He paused. Significant enough to kill a 22-year-old boy who wouldn't sign a piece of paper. She sat with that for a while. The lamp flame moved in some draft she couldn't identify. He'll come back for it, she said. He's been building toward it for 4 years, establishing the claim on paper, dealing with other business, waiting for circumstances to be right. Draven set down his cup. He came through in September. I wasn't here. I heard about it after. He was asking in town about whether I'd been up the mountain recently, whether the cabin was occupied. He was checking if you were still a problem. That's my read. And you decided to come back with a partner. I decided to stop being a problem that could be solved by one man having one accident on a trail. He said it without self-pity, purely practical. One accident is plausible. 2 accidents in the same family on the same ridge, different seasons, and someone with a federal level of interest is going to ask questions. Lenora looked at him across the table. She thought about 8 years of standing against a wall in a lamplit barn while people decided her future for her. She thought about the particular exhaustion of being defined entirely by what you lacked: money, family standing, the right kind of father, and never once by what you could actually do. She thought about Vernon Blackridge signing a dead boy's name to a document. All right, she said. All right, what? All right, I understand the full situation. She pushed back from the table and stood up and took both cups to the wash basin. We better make sure the East Trap Line is properly documented in the account books. If anyone ever challenges the established usage rights up here, I want a record that shows continuous habitation and operation going back as far as I can reconstruct it. He was quiet for a moment. That's not what I expected you to say, he said. What did you expect? I don't know. Something about leaving. She turned from the wash basin and looked at him. Cade. I came up a mountain in October on 2 days' notice with a man I didn't know because it was the first real option anyone had offered me in 26 years. I'm not leaving because the situation has complications. She paused. If I left every complicated situation, I'd never have stayed anywhere. He looked at her for a long moment. The records go back 11 years, he said finally. My father's hand for the first 3, then mine. I'll want to see all of it. I'll find them in the morning. She went to her side of the cabin and he banked the fire and they said nothing more that night, and that was all right. Some things don't need more words, some things just need to be understood, and then moved past, into the practical next thing. The weeks that followed were the hardest of her life, and also, she would think later, among the most clarifying. She learned to move through deep snow without exhausting herself, a particular gait, almost shuffling, conserving the hip flexors for the long haul. She learned which of the fur animals were worth tracking and which weren't, and how to read the signs of a healthy population versus one that was being pressured. She learned to navigate by the ridge lines and certain rock formations when visibility dropped and the landmarks she'd memorized were buried under weather. She got things wrong, regularly. She misread a sky formation in early December and they got caught 4 miles from the cabin in a fast-moving squall that came in harder and faster than she'd called it. They made it back, but she spent the entire walk back furious with herself, not spiraling, just the clean, useful kind of furious that files information for future reference. I called that wrong, she said, when they were back inside and she was trying to get feeling back into her fingers. You called it close, he said. I would have read another hour in it. It moved faster than it looked. I still called it wrong. Yeah, remember how it felt and how it looked, and you'll read it better next time. He handed her a cup of hot water. They were rationing the coffee, and sat down across from her. You're harder on yourself than the mountain is. The mountain doesn't have opinions. No. That's why it's easier to take. She looked at him. That was, for him, a remarkably complex thing to say, and she could see from his expression that he knew it. You've been out here a long time, she said. 11 winters. Alone for most of them. All of them. He turned his cup. Until now. The fire worked. The wind hit the west wall with a sound like a hand laid flat against wood, and then eased, and then came back. Outside, everything was dark and frozen and indifferent, and inside the lamp was low and the space between them was small, and she was aware of him with a specificity she'd been carefully not examining. She wasn't going to examine it now either. There was too much work to do and too much at stake, and she hadn't come up this mountain to be foolish about a man she'd known 6 weeks. But she was aware. She set her cup down and picked up the account book. The East Line numbers are good, she said. If the next 2 weeks hold, we'll be better positioned for the fat reserves than I thought. Weather's supposed to break after the new moon. Then we should move on the North Circuit before it does. I want to walk it before the snow resets. He nodded. He was watching her with those dark eyes, and she couldn't read what was in them exactly, but it wasn't nothing. You did well today? He said. Quietly, not an attempt at comfort, just a statement of fact, delivered with the same economy he applied to everything. Coming from him, she understood that it meant something. We both got back, she said. That's the standard. Yeah, he said. That's the standard. She opened the account book and began to write. He went to check the fire. The wind came back against the wall and then thought better of it. Deep in the dark outside, somewhere past the spring and the frozen tree line, something moved through the snow with 4 feet and its own urgent business. They were 6 weeks into winter and neither of them said the word yet for what was being built between them. But it was being built the way good things get built at altitude, slowly, under pressure, out of materials that have been tested and haven't broken. That was enough for now. That was, for the moment, more than enough. The storm that changed everything announced itself 3 days before it arrived. Lenore saw it first. She'd been watching the northwest sky every morning since the episode in December that she'd miscalled, making herself sit with the memory of that particular color and movement so she wouldn't make the same error twice. This was different from anything she'd seen before. The cloud bank building beyond the far ridge wasn't moving the way ordinary weather moved. It was building vertically, stacking up on itself in a way that made the air feel pressurized even at this distance, even 2 days out. Look at the northwest, she said, when Draven came back from checking the spring. He looked. He stood very still for a moment. How long do you think? She said. 3 days? Maybe a little less. He didn't take his eyes off the horizon. This is the kind of storm that kills people who make poor decisions in the 48 hours before it hits. Then we don't make poor decisions. They spent the next 2 days in controlled, systematic preparation. She managed the interior, consolidating the food stores, moving the driest wood inside, going through the medical supplies with the focused attention of someone who understood that minor problems became critical problems when you couldn't leave the cabin for a week. He worked the exterior, reinforcing the horse shelter, securing anything that could become a projectile, checking every joint and seal in the cabin structure for weaknesses. On the second day, he said he needed to run the north trap line. She looked up from the shelf she was reorganizing. Now? If I don't clear those traps before the storm, I lose them. Some of those sets are under overhangs that'll collapse with this kind of snow load. 4 hours out, 2 hours of work, 4 hours back. He was already checking his pack. I'll be back before dark. The storm could move faster than we're reading it. I know. Cade, I've done this before, he said. Not dismissively, just factually. Trapline first, then home. I know the North Circuit like I know this floor. She looked at him. She thought about arguing, and she thought about what his face would do if she argued, and she thought about the fact that he was right. Those traps represented a significant portion of their income for the season, and losing the hardware itself would be a real problem. She also thought about the color of that cloud bank this morning, which had shifted slightly and was sitting lower than it had been yesterday. Be back by dark, she said. I will. If the wind shifts before then, I'll move. He looked at her directly. I'll move immediately if it shifts. I'm not 20 years old. She handed him the extra pair of lined gloves she'd been saving. He looked at them for a moment, then took them without comment. He left at mid-morning. She watched him go until the tree line took him. She went back to work. She was good at waiting when there was work to fill it with. She finished the interior preparations and then, because she needed her hands busy, started on a careful recataloguing of the fur inventory, counting, grading, recording in the account book, building the kind of documentation that would matter when it came time to establish Draven's legitimate claims to the territory. That had become a secondary project over the past weeks, quiet and steady, rebuilding the paper record of continuous occupation, cross-referencing against his father's old ledgers, creating a timeline that would be difficult to challenge. By mid-afternoon, the light had changed. It was a specific quality of change, not darker exactly, but flatter, the way light goes when there's weather between it and the ground. She went to the door and looked at the northwest sky and felt her stomach drop. The storm had moved, not by hours. By most of a day, it was coming in faster than anything she'd seen this winter. The cloud bank now close enough that she could see the distinct gray-white curtain beneath it, where the snow was already falling on the far ridge. She looked at the tree line where Draven had gone. She looked at the sky. She calculated. He'd been gone 5 hours. If he'd moved at his normal pace, and the North Circuit was where she understood it to be, he should have been done with the trap work an hour ago and already heading back. If he'd moved on time, he had a reasonable chance of making it before the front wall hit. If anything had slowed him, a difficult set, an unexpected drift, a wrong turn in deteriorating visibility. She went inside and she put on every layer she had. She wasn't going to go looking for him. That was irrational. She didn't know the North Circuit well enough to navigate it in worsening conditions, and adding herself to the problem wouldn't help him. She put on her outer coat anyway, and her heaviest boots. She would wait until dark. He'd said dark. She would hold to that. At 4:30, the first wave of the storm hit the cabin like a fist. Not the gentle leading edge of an ordinary weather system. This was the full front, roaring down off the high country with the particular savagery of a blizzard that had been building for 3 days over open mountain terrain. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes. The wind hit the west wall hard enough to shift the lamp. Lenora stood at this window, or where the window was, the glass mostly white now, and she made her decision. She took the emergency rope. She took her knife. She took the small lantern, not because it would do much in this wind, but because it was better than nothing, and she was not going to walk into a blizzard without a light. She took the old broken sled from the equipment corner, a flat toboggan-style runner that Draven used to haul equipment up steep sections of the trap line, because her mind had gone to the kinds of scenarios where you needed to haul something, and she was not going to let that thought stop her from moving. She went out into the storm. The wind was a physical thing. It hit her sideways the moment she cleared the cabin door, strong enough that she had to turn her face away and lean into it just to stay upright. The cold was different from anything she'd experienced this winter. A dry, hard, penetrating cold that found the gaps in every layer she had. The snow was coming horizontal now, small and hard, more like sand than flake. She knew the north trail opening. She'd walked it enough times. She put her head down and moved. The first quarter mile was the worst because it was exposed. No tree cover, nothing to break the wind. She moved with her eyes mostly closed, navigating by feel and memory, counting her steps in groups of 20 the way she'd learned to do in low visibility. At 120 steps from the cabin door, there was a rock formation on the right that she'd use as a marker. She found it by feel, her gloved hand touching cold stone, and kept going. Into the trees, the wind dropped enough that she could lift her head. The snow was still falling hard, but here it came down rather than sideways, and she could see perhaps 15 feet in front of her with the lantern. She was on the trail. She kept moving. She called his name twice and then stopped, because the wind was taking the sound immediately, and she was wasting breath. She focused on the path. She had walked the North Circuit twice, both times with him. She had paid attention. She always paid attention. But knowing a trail in clear weather and navigating it in a blizzard were genuinely different skills, and she was aware, with the specific clarity that comes from being in a dangerous situation, that she was operating at the edge of what she knew. She kept moving anyway. She found the first marker, the double-trunk pine at the fork, and took the left branch, which was the circuit direction. The trail climbed here, and climbing into wind at this temperature was a real expenditure, and she made herself slow down rather than push, because she needed the reserves and burning them now would cost her later. It was at the second set of traps, the flat section near the escarpment, that she found the blood. She almost missed it. The snow was covering everything fast, but the color was still there, just visible. A dark trail through the white that went off the left side of the trail toward a stand of deadfall. She moved toward it, lantern low. He was behind the deadfall. He was conscious, barely. She could see that from 10 feet, from the way his head moved when her lantern light hit him. He was sitting with his back against a fallen tree, his left leg at an angle that told her immediately and clearly that something was wrong with it. His coat was torn across the right shoulder, and there was blood there too, dark and already partially frozen against the fabric. "Cade," she said. "Here," he said. His voice was rough and very thin. She was beside him in a moment, lantern up to see the full picture. The shoulder wound was a slash, long, deep, and from the pattern of it she knew immediately. Not a fall. She'd seen what a wolf attack looked like on livestock, and this was the same geometry, multiple strike points, the particular shape of canine assault. "How many?" she said. "3. Maybe 4. He blinked at her. His eyelashes had frost on them. "How are you? You shouldn't be out here." "I know. Where are they now?" "I hurt one of them. They backed off." He swallowed with visible effort. "But they haven't gone far." She didn't look into the dark around them. She needed to assess him, and she needed to do it quickly. "Can you move your leg?" "Some. It's not broken. I don't think it's broken." He tested it, and she watched his face. His jaw tightened, but he moved it. "I went down on the ice near the escarpment, twisted it hard. The wolves were already on me before I got up." "The shoulder, how deep?" "I don't know. I can't feel it well anymore." That was bad. She didn't say it. She pulled the rope from her pack and thought fast. She had the sled. He couldn't walk at full capacity, not for 2 miles in this storm with a compromised leg and a blood wound that was losing heat fast. She could not carry him. The sled was the only option. "I'm going to get you on the toboggan," she said. He looked at the sled. She could see him doing the same calculation she'd done. "That's going to be slow," he said. "I know." "In this storm." "I know," she said again. "Do you have a better idea?" He didn't. Getting him onto the sled was not a clean operation. He could help some. He could push with his good leg and shift his weight, but the shoulder was limiting his upper body, and every time she had to move him, he made a sound that was clearly involuntary, the sound of someone who is controlling pain with everything they have and not entirely succeeding. She got him situated. She rigged the rope to the front of the sled and looped it across her chest and shoulders, the way she'd seen oxen harnessed, distributing the weight as broadly as possible. Then she heard the wolves. Not close, but not far. Somewhere in the dark to the north of them, a sound that was more felt than heard, low, intermittent, the specific communication of animals that are waiting. She'd learned enough about predator behavior in the past 3 months to understand what that particular sound meant. They were still being tracked. She pulled. The first 10 steps told her what she was dealing with. He weighed, she didn't know exactly, 200 pounds at least, and the sled added friction on the uneven snow, and the rope harness immediately began to dig into her left shoulder through the layers. She adjusted her grip and leaned forward and pulled from her legs and her core the way you had to on steep ground, and the sled moved. It moved slowly, but it moved. She didn't think about 2 miles. She'd learned that from keeping accounts. You don't total a column while you're adding. You do the next number, and eventually you look up and the column is done. Next step. Next step. The wind was relentless. It kept trying to turn her sideways, and she kept correcting back, steering by the rock formations and the tree shapes she'd memorized, and the specific texture of the trail under the snow. Once she went wrong, the trail curved right, and she went straight for 6 steps before the change in ground told her, and she had to back up and correct, which cost time and energy she didn't have to spare. Draven was talking intermittently. She wasn't sure he knew he was doing it. "Southeast face," he said at one point. "The assay markers are at the base of the 3rd rock formation. I put them there when I figured out what Blackridge had found." "Cade," she said between breaths, "you can tell me when we're inside." "You're not," she said, "so save it." A silence. Then, "You're stubborn. You knew that from the start." She pulled. "Stop talking." He stopped talking. The wolves came once. She heard them change position, a rustling, a directional shift in their sounds. And then she heard them close enough that she stopped and turned, and they were there at the edge of her lantern light. 2 of them. Gray shapes with yellow eyes, watching her with the patient, objective assessment of animals that understand they can wait. She had her knife. She had her knife and a lantern and approximately 1 useful hand because the other was on the rope, and she was not going to put down the rope. She didn't know what she looked like to them. She hoped she looked larger than she felt. She pulled the knife with her free hand, and she held it where they could see it, and she did not run because running from wolves was the wrong decision, and she knew it, and she stood her ground and stared directly at them. The bigger one took a step forward. She stepped toward it. That surprised it. She could see the hesitation, a shift in the shoulder, a reevaluation. These animals had been tracking injured prey for the last hour. What she was doing did not fit that pattern. She took another step. She kept her eyes on the bigger one. She was aware that she was breathing too hard, and that her legs were shaking slightly, and that these things were irrelevant. The wolf held for another 3 seconds. Then it turned. The other followed. They didn't run. They moved off at a walk, into the dark, in the particular unhurried way that predators withdraw when they've decided this particular situation isn't worth the cost. They weren't gone. She knew they weren't gone, but they were not immediately behind her anymore. She turned back to the sled. She picked up the rope. She pulled. The last half-mile was the one she would not remember clearly afterward. Her body had moved past the point of comfort into a state of pure mechanical operation, arms pulling, legs pushing, lungs burning with cold air, her mind reduced to the single repeating instruction of forward, forward, forward. The storm had thickened. The lantern was doing almost nothing at this point, but she could feel the trail with her feet, and she kept going. The cabin appeared out of the white like something imagined, and then the specific solid dark rectangle of it was real, and she was at the door, and she couldn't get her hands to work on the latch for a moment, and then she could, and she got it open. Getting him inside took the last of what she had. He helped as much as he could, crawled the last 3 feet on his hands and one good leg while she managed the door and the light. And then they were both inside on the floor with the door shut against the storm and the fire still banked low in the corner, throwing enough warmth to make the difference between the inside and the outside feel almost violent in its contrast. She lay on the floor for 45 seconds. She counted them. 45 seconds was what she allowed herself. Then she got up. She got the fire built up first because warmth was the most urgent thing. Then she got the lamp lit and the water onto heat because she needed to clean the shoulder wound, and she needed it warm, not cold. Then she went to him. He was conscious, which was better than the alternative. Pale, and his hands were shaking with the cold, and there was a grayness around his mouth she didn't like. But his eyes were tracking, and he knew where he was. She got his coat off. The shoulder wound was bad, but not catastrophic. Long, deep in places, but it had clotted some in the cold, which was the one useful thing the cold had done all night. She cleaned it with what they had, which wasn't much. and she stitched what needed stitching using the kit she'd quietly moved to the top of the medical supplies 2 months ago because she'd known, abstractly, that this day would eventually exist. He didn't make a sound while she stitched. When she finished, she looked up and found him watching her. "How is it?" he said. "Manageable. You're going to feel it for weeks." She tied off the last suture. "The leg?" "Sprained, not broken. I can feel it better now." "Can you move it?" He moved it. His face did the thing again, the controlled tightening, but he moved it. "Yeah." She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and the adrenaline that had been carrying her for the last 3 hours began to come down, and she felt the full weight of her body all at once. The shoulder where the rope had dug in, her legs, her hands, the specific exhaustion of someone who has spent everything they had and is now sitting in the aftermath. She was shaking. She hadn't noticed until now. "Lenora," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "You're shaking." "I just hauled 200 pounds of man 2 miles through a blizzard with wolves on my back. I'm entitled to shake." He was quiet for a moment, then very quietly. "You came out in that?" "Yes." "I told you." "You told me you'd be back by dark," she said. "It was past dark. I came." She met his eyes. "Don't make a thing of it." "I'm not making a thing of it." His voice had changed. Some quality in it that was different from his ordinary register, lower, more careful, like something that had been held in place for a long time was sitting closer to the surface. "I'm saying—" He stopped. "You don't have to say anything. I know I don't have to." He looked at her with those dark eyes that she'd spent 3 months learning to read and still couldn't read completely. Not yet, not all the way. "I'm saying that nobody has ever—" He stopped again. He didn't seem to know what to do with the sentence. She understood. She understood because she felt something similar and didn't know what to do with it either. "Go to sleep," she said. "You've lost blood and you're half frozen and you need to rest." "The wolves, they're not coming through the walls. Sleep." He looked at her for another moment. Then he let his head fall back against the rolled coat she'd put under it, and his eyes closed, and within a few minutes his breathing evened out. She sat beside him and listened to the storm work itself against the cabin walls. Brutal and relentless and completely indifferent, the way the mountain was always indifferent. And yet here were two people inside it who were the opposite of indifferent to each other, and she didn't know exactly when that had happened or what it meant going forward. She knew what it felt like. She put more wood on the fire. She pulled her knees to her chest and sat with her back against the wall, and she watched him breathe. Outside, the storm did what storms do, raged and spent itself and raged again, trying the walls and finding them solid. Inside, the lamp held. Whatever this was between them, it had a shape now. Not a simple shape, not a comfortable one, but real. Built from the same materials everything real was built from up here. Hard work and hard weather, and the particular knowledge of what a person does when they have every reason to turn back and they don't. She didn't have a name for it yet. She didn't need one tonight. He healed slowly, and he was terrible at it. That was the thing about men who had spent years operating entirely on their own terms. They had no practice being the one who needed tending. The first 2 days after the blizzard, he slept hard, which was fine, which was what his body needed. It was the third day that became the problem, when he woke up clear-headed and decided that the shoulder was good enough and the leg was functional enough, and he was going to go check the south trap line. "You're not," Lenora said, from the table where she was working through the fur inventory. "It's been 3 days. The stitches need another week minimum before you're putting that shoulder underload. And I watched you walk to the door this morning. You're still favoring the leg." "I always favor the left side." "You don't. I've been watching you walk for 3 months." She didn't look up from the account book. "Sit down." A silence. She could feel him standing in the middle of the cabin deciding something. "Lenora, I'll run the south line today. I've done it twice already, and the weather's clear. Sit down and eat something and look at the old survey maps if you need your hands busy." She finally looked up. "You're not going to undo 3 miles of hauling and 15 sutures by being impatient. I will not allow it." He stared at her. "You'll what?" he said. "I said what I said." Another silence. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He did it with the specific controlled movement of a man who is not admitting he's in pain, which meant he was in more pain than he was letting on. She went back to the inventory. The south line's been running well, she said, neutrally, letting him have the subject change. If the snowpack holds, we should get another good 2 weeks before the melt starts to affect the lower sets. Check the third set from the creek crossing. The anchor stake was loose last time I ran it. I know, I noted it. He was quiet for a moment. You noted everything. That's what accounts are for. She heard him pull the survey maps toward him across the table, the soft scrape of old paper. She kept writing. This was what recovery looked like in a one-room cabin above the timberline. The ongoing negotiation of close quarters and stubborn natures, the daily management of what a person could and couldn't do, the particular intimacy of seeing someone at their least capable and having to treat it matter-of-factly because the work still needed doing. He had not spoken again about what had happened the night of the blizzard. Neither had she. But it was there between them the same way the account books were there, a record that couldn't be undone. Something had been decided that night without words. She wasn't sure of all its implications. She was sure of the fact of it. She ran the south line. She fixed the loose stake. She came back in the late afternoon with 3 good catches and a raven that had been following her since the creek crossing and seemed personally offended when she ignored it. He had made dinner. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at him standing at the small stove, managing a pan left-handed because the right shoulder still limited him, and she understood from the fact that he'd done it at all, something he hadn't done once since she arrived, that had been her domain from the first week, that this was his version of the same thing she hadn't said either. She hung up her coat. That smells good, she said. It's the same stew it always is, he said. I know, it still smells good. They ate without much conversation, but it was the comfortable kind of without conversation, the kind that had developed over months of shared work and shared space. After, he spread the old survey maps across the table and they went over them together, the original boundary lines, the assay points he'd marked, the sections where Black Ridge's falsified documents overlapped with the Cade family's legitimate established rights. She had been building a counter-document for weeks. She laid it alongside the surveys now. The account records going back 11 years, the notation of trapline locations and usage patterns, the careful timeline she'd reconstructed from Draven's father's ledgers. It was not a legal brief, but it was the foundation of one, the kind of layered, consistent record that made a story legible to people with the authority to act on it. If we get this to the right federal office, she said, the falsified signature alone is enough to open an investigation. Combined with the established usage record and the timeline of Black Ridge's movements. We need to get to spring first, Draven said. I know. And Black Ridge needs to not know we have this before then. I know that too. She looked at the maps. Did anyone in town know you'd been collecting this? No, I've been careful. Hollis? Anyone you trust there? He thought about it. Hollis knows the land. He knew my father. He doesn't talk. He paused. There's also a man named Prentice, former land office clerk. He left the county office the same year Callum died. I always thought he left because he knew something about the documents and didn't want to be near it. Do you know where he is now? Laramie, last I heard. Lenore wrote the name in the margin of the account book. Prentice, Laramie. She underlined it. They were still going over the maps when the horses shifted in the shelter outside. A particular restless movement, not the ordinary settling sounds of animals at night, but something more alert, more communicative. Both of them went still at the same moment. Draven was up first, moving to the small window, and she was right behind him. Outside, the moonlight on the snow was bright enough to see by. The ridge above the cabin was clean and white. 2 figures crossed the lower tree line, not animals. The silhouette was wrong for animals. Too upright, moving too purposefully in a specific direction. They're surveying, Draven said. His voice was very quiet. Looking at access routes. In February, she said, Black Ridge knows I was hurt. Someone in town told him. His jaw was set. This is him checking whether the ridge is open. She thought about the timing, the blizzard, his injuries, the gap in their normal movement patterns during his recovery. If someone in Black Hollow had seen or heard that Draven Cade had come off the mountain hurt, and that information had reached Black Ridge. He's going to move before spring, she said, if he thinks I'm incapacitated. Yes. Are you? He looked at her. No, he said. She looked at the 2 figures until they moved back into the trees and were gone. All right, she said, then we need to be ready before he is. Over the next 3 weeks, Lenora walked every trail on the mountain. Not as exercise, not as patrol. Methodically, with the account book and a separate field notebook she'd repurposed, mapping every access route from the lower valley to the ridge with the specific attention of someone who is not planning to fight terrain, but to use it. She noted snow shelf depths along the south-facing sections where sun loading created instability. She noted the narrow section of the East Pass where the trail bent sharply around a rock face and the footing was deceptive, solid-looking crust over unconsolidated drift. She noted the 3 natural choke points where the main approach trails narrowed to widths that forced single-file movement. She also noted where Draven's existing trap lines intersected with these access routes, and she began making adjustments, repositioning certain sets, adding new configurations in locations she'd identified. Draven watched her work for the first week without asking questions. The second week he came with her. His shoulder was better. His leg was fully functional. He moved through the terrain with his normal economy, but there was something different in how he watched her work, a quality of attention that she recognized because she'd felt it herself early on when she was learning from him. That placement, he said, watching her set a modified configuration at the East Pass choke point. That's not for trapping. No, she said. Not animals, anyway. He was quiet for a moment. You're planning the whole thing. I'm planning our options. She finished the set and stood up, brushing snow from her knees. I'm not planning on a fight if we can avoid it. If Blackridge sends men up here with legal documents and the backing of a corrupt county office, we can't shoot our way out of it. That's not a plan. But if they come without legal standing, if they come as what they are, which is men trying to take something that isn't theirs, then the mountain should work in our favor and not theirs. He looked at her steadily. You've been thinking about this since the blizzard. I've been thinking about this since the night you told me about Callum. She held his gaze. I didn't say anything because I was still working it out. I'm still working it out. But the foundation is sound. He walked the section of trail above the choke point, testing the snow surface with his boot, reading the structure of the drift the way she'd seen him read animal tracks, patiently, from multiple angles. He crouched down and examined the snow shelf she'd noted in her book. If this section goes, he said, it takes the whole approach with it. It takes about 40 feet of the approach, which is enough to block it for 3 days minimum, probably 5. And the alternative route goes through the East Pass choke point, she paused, where I just put the configuration. He stood up and looked at her. You walked all of this yourself, he said. I had help. You taught me to read the terrain. I taught you the basics. This is... He stopped. He looked back at the snow shelf, then at the choke point, then at her. This is a different level. I had more to protect, she said simply. It focuses the mind. He was quiet for a moment, then, show me the rest. She showed him the rest. They spent 3 days walking every route she'd identified, and he added to the plan where he knew the terrain better. A secondary approach she'd missed on the north side, a frozen creek crossing that would look like an option but was unsound beneath the surface ice. A section of the western trail where sound carried in a particular way that meant you could hear movement from a quarter-mile further than you'd expect. Blackridge arrived on the first clear day of March. She heard the horses before she saw them, that carrying quality of the western trail exactly as Draven had described it, and she was already at the secondary position when he appeared below the tree line with 6 men. 7 total. All of them armed. 2 of them had the look of hired muscle, big, patient, the kind of men who did this kind of work regularly. The others were a mix. She could see from the way one of them moved slightly apart from the others, holding papers, that this was the legal threat. A man with documents, ready to present a claim. Blackridge himself was not what she'd pictured from Draven's descriptions. She'd expected someone physically imposing, a large man, the kind whose size reinforces his assumption of authority. He was medium height, well-dressed, even up here, with a gray beard trimmed close and the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had spent decades getting what he wanted by appearing entirely reasonable until the moment he didn't need to appear reasonable anymore. He was perhaps 60. He had the eyes of a man who had learned that other people's discomfort was simply an instrument to be played. Draven was at the cabin. They had agreed he stayed visible, present, clearly recovered. The point was not to hide that he was functional, The point was to let Blackridge commit to his approach before he understood what the approach would cost him. She watched from the secondary position, high on the ridge above the main trail, as the group moved upward. They took the main approach as expected. She let them get to the third marker, the distinctive leaning pine she'd been using as a reference point, before she moved to the first position. Blackridge's lead man was 20 feet from the snow shelf she'd identified when she triggered the first diversion. Not the shelf itself. Not yet. A smaller set, positioned to redirect rather than block, designed to produce the specific sound and movement that made experienced men in uncertain terrain stop and reconsider their route. The group stopped. She could hear the consultation from her position. Voices, sharp and low, the lead man pointing in two directions. They redirected. Toward the east pass, as she'd anticipated. She moved. She had spent 3 weeks learning to move through this terrain quickly and quietly, and she was better at it than she would have been in October when she'd arrived knowing nothing. She reached the east pass position before they reached the lower approach, and she settled into the outcropping above the choke point, where the view was clean and the wind was in her favor. They came in single file. They had to. The trail forced it. The first 2 men through the choke point stopped on the far side in the flat section waiting for the others. Blackridge was fifth in line. The man with the documents was directly ahead of him, still holding the paper roll with the careful possessiveness of someone whose entire purpose is that paper roll. She waited until Blackridge was 3 steps into the choke point. The configuration she'd set released cleanly. A controlled collapse of the snow berm on the high side of the trail. Not a slide, but a drop, filling the narrow section with consolidated snow up to chest height in under 4 seconds. No one was hurt. It was not designed to hurt. It was designed to separate. The 3 men ahead of Blackridge were now cut off from the 4 men behind, including Blackridge himself and the 2 hired heavies. Then Draven's voice came from above and to the north, calm, carrying in that specific way the western approach carried sound. "Mr. Blackridge." Blackridge turned in the blocked trail. He looked up. His face was controlled. She had to give him that. But there was something working beneath it. "Cade," he said. His voice was the careful, reasonable voice she'd anticipated. "I'm glad to see you're well. I'd heard you had an accident." "You heard right. I'm recovered." Draven was positioned on the upper section of the north trail, visible but not reachable. Not easily, not quickly. "I see you brought company." "I have legitimate business on this ridge. My attorney has documentation establishing—" "I know what your documentation says. I've had all winter to study it." A pause. "I've also had all winter to build my own." Blackridge looked at the blocked trail ahead of him, then back at the 2 heavies behind him. He looked up at Draven. "This is obstruction," he said. "You understand I have legal standing?" "At the county level, yes. That's been useful for you so far." Draven's voice didn't change. "The Federal Land Office in Cheyenne has a different view. They've had correspondence from me since November. They have the account records, the original boundary surveys, the timeline of your claim filing, and a statement from a former county clerk named Prentice regarding the documentation process for that claim." The silence that followed was very clean. Blackridge's face didn't break, but something in his posture changed. Something shifted in the careful architecture of his reasonable manner. "You're bluffing," he said. Lenora came down from the outcropping. She didn't rush. She moved at a deliberate pace, coming down the slope above the choke point to the flat section where 3 of Blackridge's men were standing, separated from their employer. And she had the account book in one hand, open to the correspondence section, and she looked at Blackridge with the same steady, unemotional attention she'd given to every difficult number and every difficult set of books she'd ever managed. "I'm not him," she said. "I'm the partner, and I'm also the one who has been building the evidentiary record for the past 4 months. She held up the account book. "This documents continuous habitation and commercial operation on this territory going back 11 years. Combined with the original trapping rights from before your surveys were conducted, it establishes prior claim that supersedes a county-level filing." She paused. "Especially a county-level filing that includes a forged signature." Blackridge looked at her. He looked at her the way men like him look at variables they hadn't accounted for. Not with anger, not immediately, but with a recalculating attention that was almost worse. "Who are you?" he said. "Lenora Vale. I'm in the account books. My name is on the partnership agreement, which was witnessed and filed in Laramie in December." She closed the account book. Prentice witnessed it, as a matter of fact. He was helpful. One of the three men on the far side of the choke point, the one with the paper roll, had gone very still. She watched him look at the blocked trail, then at her, then at the papers in his hand with the specific expression of someone who has just realized they're holding something that might become a liability. "Call your men back," Draven said from above. Still calm. "Leave the mountain. Whatever claim you filed at the county level is going to be examined by people who don't work for you, and I'd recommend you spend the time between now and that examination getting your own documentation in order. You have nothing that will hold in. I have 11 years of accounts. I have Prentice. I have a forged signature on a document that a federal examiner is going to compare to your other filings." Draven's voice hadn't changed in temperature. Not once. "And I have the record of your survey team being on this mountain in February while I was recovering from injuries, which I can put inside a timeline that ends with your name very close to a 22-year-old boy who died on a trail that didn't fail by itself." The silence was longer this time. She watched Blackridge's face work through something. She'd seen that process in debtors. The moment when the arithmetic of the situation stops adding up in their favor and they have to decide what to do with that fact. Some of them argued. Some of them made threats. The smart ones did the same thing Blackridge did. He turned to the heavy behind him and said quietly, something she couldn't hear. The heavy nodded. He looked at the two men on the far side of the choke point and made a gesture. They began to move back down the eastern approach. Blackridge looked up at Draven one more time. His face had settled into something that was neither angry nor defeated. It was the face of a man who was already thinking 3 moves ahead and knew this was not finished. "This isn't over, Cade," he said. "No," Draven said. "It's not. But it's moved somewhere you don't control anymore." Blackridge turned and walked back down the mountain. His men followed. The document man tucked the paper roll under his arm and went with them, and she noted that he didn't look back. She stood in the blocked pass and watched them go. When they were out of sight, she let out a breath that felt like it had been held since the night she'd hauled Draven home through the blizzard. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from cold. Draven came down from the north trail. He came to where she was standing, and he stopped beside her, and they both looked at the empty lower approach. "Prentice," he said, "the correspondence." "All real," she said. "I wrote to him in November, the week after you told me about Callum. He responded in December. The letters are in the tin box." He looked at her. "You did all of that," he said, "without telling me. I didn't want to tell you until I knew whether it would hold. I didn't know if Prentice would respond or whether he'd be willing to put his name on anything. It took time." She paused. "I also didn't want to give you hope that didn't materialize. That seemed worse than not saying." He was quiet for a long moment. They were standing close, closer than the necessities of the conversation required. And she was aware of that the way she'd been aware of it since the night of the blizzard, that ongoing, careful, not examined awareness. "My brother," he said, very quietly. "If the investigation, if they can actually... I don't know what they can prove about Callum. I want to be honest with you about that. Prentice knows the documents were irregular, but he doesn't have direct evidence of what happened on the trail." She met his eyes. "But the investigation into the filing is real. And once a federal examiner is looking at Blackridge's paper trail with that question in mind, they tend to find other things." He nodded slowly. She thought about everything that had gone into the winter. Every morning she'd woken before dawn and gone to work in the frozen dark. Every trap she'd set wrong and then right. Every calculation in the account books. Every mile she'd walked memorizing the shape of this mountain. She thought about that first night in the Hollis barn, the east wall, the brown wool dress with the repaired hem. She thought about what her father had said when she left. Don't let them take the ridge. She hadn't. "We need to get the documentation consolidated before we go down to Cheyenne," she said, because she was not the kind of person who sat in a significant moment longer than it needed to be sat in. "I want everything in order before we present it formally." "Spring," he said. "Another few weeks." "Another few weeks?" she agreed. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just picked it up, her right hand in his left. The way you take something you've been careful with for a long time and have finally stopped pretending you don't want to hold. She let him. She turned her palm up and closed her fingers around his. They stood on the ridge in the cold March light with the mountain quiet around them and the empty trail below where Blackridge's men had been, and neither of them said anything because some things don't need words to be true. They went back to the cabin. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do, and they both knew it, and they went and did it. But they went together, and his hand was warm, and the mountain was theirs. Spring came to the high country the way it always did. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm day followed by 3 cold ones. Snow that melted to mud and then froze again overnight. The creek finding its voice under the ice before the ice was fully ready to let it go. It was March giving way to April, 1 reluctant degree at a time. And Lenora watched it from the cabin door each morning with the same attention she'd given to the northwest sky all winter, reading what it meant for the trails below. They needed the lower passes clear before they could take the horses down. That meant waiting, and waiting was its own kind of work. She spent it finishing the documentation. The account books were already in order. They had been for weeks, but she went through them a final time, checking every entry, every cross-reference, every date against the original survey maps, and the correspondence with Prentice. She was not going to arrive in front of a federal land examiner with a single loose thread. She had spent too long pulling this together to let it unravel over a transcription error or a date she hadn't verified twice. Draven watched her do this with the particular patience of a man who understood thoroughness because he'd practiced it in different domains his whole life. He didn't rush her. He worked on the cabin repairs the winter had deferred, a section of roof that needed attention, a joint in the horse shelter that had shifted under snow load. And in the evenings, they sat at the table together and went over the documents one more time, and he told her everything he remembered about the weeks surrounding Callum's death. And she wrote it down in the careful, precise language of a formal account. It was hard for him. She could see that. He told it steadily, without breaking, but there were moments when he'd stop in the middle of a sentence and look at the table and she'd wait without speaking, and eventually he'd find the thread again and continue. "The survey team," he said one evening in late March. "There were 4 of them. I got 2 of their names from the county record. A man named Aldous worked the southeast face. He had a partner, last name Birch." She wrote the names down. "Are either of them still in the territory?" "Aldous died 2 years ago. Birch, I don't know. He left after the survey. Prentice might know where he went. People in that business tend to overlap." She made a note to ask, "Even if we can't find Birch, the survey documentation itself, the methodology, the timing, the fact that the assay results were never properly filed with the Public Land Office, that's its own line of evidence." "You sound like a lawyer," he said. "I sound like someone who has managed other people's complicated situations for 20 years and finally has one worth managing." She looked up. "Do you trust the examiner Prentice mentioned, the one in Cheyenne?" "Prentice vouches for him. That's enough for me." He paused. "Whether a federal examiner's honesty survives contact with Blackridge's money is a different question." "It's a question we can't answer until we're in the room," she said, "so we go to the room and find out." He nodded slowly. He looked at the documents spread across the table, the accumulated paper record of everything they'd built and everything that had been taken and everything they intended to recover. "Callum would have been 26 this year," he said. He said it quietly, not looking for a response, just setting it down somewhere outside of himself. She set down her pen. "I know," she said. "I've thought about him. I've thought about him every time I added a date to the timeline." She paused. "I think the best thing we can do for him at this point is make sure the record is so clear that nobody who looks at it can pretend not to understand what happened." He didn't say anything, but something in his face settled, the way a thing settles when it's been placed correctly. They left the cabin on the 5th of April. The trails were muddy, and in places the runoff had changed the footing significantly from what she'd memorized over the winter, which meant the descent took longer than she'd anticipated. They had to pick their way carefully through 3 sections that the snowmelt had altered, and Belle was unhappy about a particular stretch of the East Trail that had developed a sinkhole where firm ground used to be. But they got down. The valley looked different in spring, larger somehow, and louder. Birds, the creek noise from the drainage, the general aliveness of a landscape coming back from dormancy. She had been above the timberline for 6 months, and the transition felt significant in her body, like a pressure change. They rode toward Black Hollow without stopping in the valley. She had thought she might feel something complicated about returning, but she didn't, particularly. She felt the same thing she'd felt most of the winter, focused on the task, aware of what needed doing, ready to do it. What she hadn't expected was the town itself. Black Hollow in April was mud season Black Hollow, not its best presentation. But people were out, and people saw them ride in, and the specific quality of attention that followed them down the main street was different from anything she'd experienced in 26 years of living there. She'd been looked at before, looked past, looked through. Looked at with pity or dismissal or the particular polite blankness that meant someone was doing the calculation of what you were worth to them. This was different. Agnes Hollis was the first person to actually stop and come toward them, which surprised Lenore because Agnes Hollis was not a woman who crossed muddy streets for just any occasion. "Lenora Vale," she said, looking up at her on Belle's back with an expression that was complicated and genuine. "I heard Blackridge's men came down off the mountain in March looking like they'd misplaced something." "They left some things behind," Lenore said. "We're on our way to Cheyenne to return them." Agnes looked at her for a moment and then, unexpectedly, laughed. A real laugh, not polite. "Well," she said. "Good." They stayed one night in Black Hollow. Lenora went to see her father. He was better than she'd feared and worse than she'd hoped, which was about what she'd expected. He was out of the storage shed, which was something. The tanner's wife had taken a liking to him over the winter in a practical, unsentimental way, and he'd been doing small maintenance work around the yard in exchange for a room that was at least attached to a real structure. He was still drinking, but less, or at least differently. She could see that from his face, which was clearer than it had been in years. He looked at her standing in the tanner's yard, and he did what he'd done when she left. He cried a little and turned his head so she couldn't quite see it. "You look different," he said. "I've been outside for 6 months." "That's not what I mean." He studied her face. "You look like your mother. I mean that is the best thing I know how to say." She sat with him for 2 hours. She told him what had happened, the broad shape of it, the documents, Prentice, Blackridge, on the mountain in March. She told him about Callum Cade. She told him about the ridge and what was under it, and why it had mattered enough for a young man to die. He listened with the careful attention she'd noticed in him the night she left, that older, steadier version of himself that emerged sometimes now, the version that hadn't been entirely consumed. "The ridge," he said when she finished. "I knew something was wrong with how that claim was handled, years ago. I didn't know what specifically. He stopped. "I should have done something with that, with the knowing." "You told me not to let them take it," she said. "That's what you had to give, and you gave it." He looked at his hands. "Are you coming back?" he said. "After Cheyenne." "To Black Hollow?" "Yes." She thought about this honestly. "I'll come back, but I don't think I'll stay." She paused. "The ridge is in my name now, half of it. There's work to do there that matters." He nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He seemed to understand that this was not abandonment. It was something else, something that had a different shape. When she stood to leave, he said, "The man, Cade." "Yes?" "Is he good to you?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "He's honest with me. He works alongside me. He doesn't ask me to be something I'm not." She paused. "Yes, he's good to me." Her father nodded. He looked at the yard around him, at the thin April sun on the mud, at nothing much in particular. "Then go," he said. "Go do the thing." She went. The ride to Cheyenne took 4 days. They camped 2 nights and stayed at a way station the 3rd. It was different from the mountain, lower, warmer, the landscape opening up into the broad Wyoming plain that had a beauty she'd never had much time for before because she'd been too busy being poor in a small town to notice horizons. She noticed them now. They talked differently on this ride than they had on the mountain. The mountain had been task and survival, and the ongoing management of immediate problems. This was open country with moderate weather and no urgent demands, and it turned out that when the pressure was removed, what was left between them was easy, not simple. She wasn't sure anything about either of them would ever be simple, but easy in the sense of unforced, in the sense of 2 people who had been through enough together that they didn't need to perform anything for the other. He told her about his father. She told him about her mother. These were the real stories, the ones that explain what a person is built from. And she'd held hers carefully for a long time, not because she was ashamed, but because she'd learned early that not everyone handled other people's real stories with any care. He handled hers carefully. She handled his the same way. On the third night, by a fire that was smaller than necessary because the weather was mild, and she'd built it out of habit rather than need, he said, "After this, after Cheyenne, what do you want?" She poked at the fire with a stick. "To win the hearing." "After the hearing." She looked up. He was watching her across the fire with that steady, dark attention she'd spent a winter learning. "I want to go back to the ridge," she said. "I want to build something there that lasts." The supply operation could be expanded. There are 2 other trapping operations in the territory that don't have proper logistics support, and if we offered it, they'd pay for it. The fur accounts can be centralized. The documentation is already in place. She paused. "I want to make it something that couldn't be taken by a forged signature because it's too established, too on record, too many people depending on it to disappear quietly." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of work." "Yes," she said. "I know." "You'd need a partner." "I know that too." He looked at her across the fire. "Lenora," he said. "Cade, I've been alone on that mountain for 11 years, he said. "I told myself it was what I needed, that the isolation was useful." He turned his cup in his hands the way he did when he was choosing words carefully. "I was wrong about that. I was wrong about it for a long time before you arrived, and I hadn't admitted it yet." She didn't say anything. She'd learned that some of his sentences needed room at the end. "I'm asking if you'd stay," he said. "Not as a working arrangement. Not as a partner in the account book sense." He met her eyes. "I'm asking if you'd stay." She thought about the east wall of the Hollis barn. She thought about 7 men in one night and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being measured against the wrong scale for so long you almost start to believe the measurement. She thought about Belle picking her way through the frozen East Pass, and the wolves at the edge of the lantern light, and the rope harness digging into her shoulder for 2 miles of dark frozen trail. She thought about sitting up through the night watching him breathe, and the account books, and the look on Blackridge's face when he understood that the variable he hadn't accounted for was a woman from Black Hollow who had spent 6 months turning a mountain into an argument she was going to win. She thought about her father's face this morning. "You look like your mother." "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." He exhaled. Not dramatically, just a single breath that seemed to release something that had been held for a long time. He reached across the fire and she took his hand, the same way she had on the ridge in March, and they sat with the mild Wyoming night around them and the fire burning down to coals. It was not a perfect moment. Her back ached from 4 days in the saddle. She had a blister on her left heel that had come back. There was a significant legal hearing in 2 days that might not go the way they needed it to go. She was happy in spite of all of this, and because of all of this, and she wasn't sure the distinction mattered. The federal land office in Cheyenne was a 3-story stone building with more official weight per square foot than anything in Black Hollow, and Lenora walked into it with the tin box under her arm and her good boots on, resoled over the winter with leather she'd cut herself. And she did not feel small. The examiner was a man named Asa Garfield, 50-something, with the deliberate thoroughness of someone who had spent decades separating legitimate claims from fraudulent ones and had developed a professional distaste for the latter. Prentice had vouched for him, and Prentice had been right. This was a man who looked at documents the way Lenora looked at accounts, with the specific attention of someone who understood that the numbers either told the truth or they didn't. The hearing took 2 days. The first day was their presentation. She had organized the documentation into a sequence that built logically: the original trapping rights, the continuous operational record, the correspondence with Prentice, the analysis of the falsified filing, the timeline placing Blackridge's activity in relation to Callum's death. She presented it herself, which she'd decided on the ride down. Draven knew the land. She knew the paper. Garfield asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. When she didn't know something, she said so and directed him to the document that addressed it most closely and let him draw the conclusion rather than drawing it for him, because she'd learned from managing complicated accounts that examiners didn't like being told what to think. They liked being given everything they needed to think it themselves. Blackridge's representative attended on the second day with a stack of his own documentation and a lawyer who was very good at his job. She'd expected this. She'd written notes in the margins of the relevant counter-documents months ago, anticipating the arguments, and she sat at the table while the lawyer spoke, and she did not let her face do anything interesting. When they were given the opportunity to respond, she opened to page 37 of the account book, the section she'd marked, and she laid it on the table in front of Garfield. The filing date on Mr. Blackridge's survey claim is October 14th, she said. The date recorded in our operational account for the Southeast Face Trap Circuit is October 2nd of the same year, 12 days before. This entry is in a different hand than the surrounding entries because the notation was made by Callum Cade, who ran that circuit independently that month. The handwriting has been verified by two people who knew him. She paused. The same hand that made that notation is the hand on the document Mr. Blackridge claims carries Callum Cade's signature. They don't match. She set the two documents side by side. Garfield looked at them for a long time. Blackridge's lawyer said something about independent verification and procedural requirements and the limitations of handwriting comparison. He was not wrong on the procedural points. She didn't argue them. She let Garfield look at the documents and she waited. That evening, she and Draven ate dinner at a restaurant in Cheyenne that was considerably better than anything available in Black Hollow, and she had coffee that was considerably better than anything available above the timberline, and they didn't talk much about the hearing because there was nothing more to do for it. They'd given everything they had. The rest was Garfield. If it doesn't hold, Draven said, if he finds a procedural reason to defer, then we find another avenue, she said. Prentice has connections at the territorial governor's level. It's slower, but it exists. You've already thought about the secondary path. I always think about the secondary path. He looked at her across the table. The restaurant around them was warm and lamplight, and the noise of other people's conversations. And she was aware of him with the same specificity she'd been aware of him since the night of the blizzard. Aware and no longer pretending she wasn't. Lenora, he said. Don't thank me, she said. I hate when you try to thank me. I wasn't going to thank you. Then what? He was quiet for a moment. I was going to say that I think you're the most capable person I've ever known, and I spent 11 years telling myself that what I needed was to be left alone, and I was wrong, and I'm glad I was wrong. He paused. That's all. She looked at him for a moment. That's considerably more than what you usually say, she said. It's a special occasion. She smiled at him, not the managed expression she'd given the world for most of her adult life, but the real one, the one that felt like something finally off duty. You're not wrong about the capability, she said. For the record, Garfield issued his preliminary finding on the third morning. He didn't give them everything immediately. Federal processes don't work that way, and she hadn't expected them to. What he gave them was a formal stay of Blackridge's county-level claim pending full federal review, a notice of investigation into the documentation irregularities, and a separate notice that the territorial authority would be examining the circumstances of Callum Cade's death in light of the timeline evidence. It was not a complete victory. It was something better than a complete victory. It was the mechanism of accountability being set in motion with enough institutional weight behind it that Blackridge couldn't simply wait it out or buy his way clear. Standing on the steps of the federal land office in April sunlight, she held the copies of those 3 documents, and she felt the specific quality of relief that comes not from things being resolved, but from things being in the hands of people whose job is to resolve them. She had carried this for 6 months. It was still hers. She wasn't finished with it, not by any measure, but she was no longer carrying it alone in the dark. Draven stood beside her. He read the documents over her shoulder. The investigation into Callum, he said. It's a separate track from the land claim. It may not go anywhere. I want to be straight with you about that. She turned to look at him. But it's open. It's formally open with a federal reference number. That means Blackridge has to answer questions he's never had to answer before. He was quiet for a while. She let him be quiet. He was 22, Draven said finally. The same thing he'd said at the cabin table in March, setting it down somewhere. I know, she said, and everyone who matters now knows his name and what happened to him and who was involved. That's not nothing. That's not close to nothing. He nodded. He looked out at the street, Cheyenne going about its business in the April morning, indifferent in the way cities are indifferent, everyone with their own urgent concerns. Let's go home, he said. She liked the word. She felt it land somewhere in her chest and settle. Yes, she said, let's. They rode back through Black Hollow on the way north because there was paperwork to file with the county regarding the partnership agreement. A formality, but she was done with leaving formalities unaddressed, and because she wanted to see her father one more time before they went back up. The town received them differently than it had 2 weeks before. Word had traveled. It always did. And the shape of what had happened on the mountain and in Cheyenne had arrived in Black Hollow ahead of them in the form of rumor and partial fact and the telephone game distortion that turns real events into something slightly larger and more dramatic than they actually were, which in this case meant the version Black Hollow was telling itself was not entirely inaccurate. She filed the papers at the county office. The clerk, a young woman she didn't know, handled the partnership documents with professional neutrality and then looked up and said plainly, "Are you the one who ran Black Ridge's men off the ridge?" "With help," Lenora said. The clerk nodded with the small, satisfied expression of someone who is very glad a specific thing has happened in the world. She went to see her father. He was in better shape than 2 weeks prior. The sun had been out, he'd been working in the yard. There was more color in his face than she'd seen in years. She told him about Cheyenne. She told him about the stay, the investigation, the reference number with the federal authority. He listened and he understood what he was hearing. She could see from his face that he understood the significance of it. "Callum Cade," he said when she finished. "Yes, I remember when he died. I remember thinking there was something wrong with the story." He rubbed his face. "I didn't do anything with that either." "Papa, I know. He waved a hand, not dismissing her, dismissing his own spiral before it started. "You did. That's what matters." She stayed an hour. She helped him carry some lumber from the back of the tanner's yard to a stack that needed reorganizing. Quiet work, side by side, the kind that doesn't require conversation. When she was leaving, he caught her arm for a moment and held it without saying anything, and she put her hand over his, and that was enough. She rode back to where Draven was waiting at the north edge of town. He had the horses ready. The mountain was visible from here on a clear day, and it was a clear day. The high country still snow-capped, still enormous, still entirely indifferent to what any particular person made of their time in its vicinity. She looked at it. She had been afraid of it, she realized. Not consciously, not in a way she'd admitted to herself, but underneath all the practicality and the account books and the deliberate forward motion, there had been the ongoing knowledge that she was operating at the edge of her capability in a place that did not make exceptions for effort or determination. The mountain didn't care how hard she tried, it only cared what she actually did. That had been the lesson, the real one, beneath everything else. You don't get credit for what you're capable of. You get credit for what you do with it, in the specific circumstances you're given, with the tools you actually have. Not the tools you wish you had, not the circumstances you'd prefer, the ones you're standing in. She had stood in hers. She turned Bell north. People in Black Hollow would talk about that winter for years. The stories shifted in the telling, details changed, the numbers grew, the distances became longer and the weather more extreme. That was all right. That was what stories did. But the core of it stayed true because the core of it was simple enough to survive the retelling. A woman who had been counted out found the one situation that needed exactly what she had, and she gave it everything, and it was enough, more than enough. Years later, travelers passing through the territory sometimes stopped in Black Hollow and asked about the Cadevale operation on the ridge. It had a reputation for honest dealing and solid logistics support, and trappers and traders across 3 counties knew the name. The older residents of Black Hollow would tell them about that winter, about the blizzard and the wolves and the mountain, about a federal hearing in Cheyenne and a man named Blackridge who had overestimated his own position and underestimated a woman he'd never bothered to look at clearly. They told it well. They'd had years of practice. What they didn't always get right, what got lost sometimes in the retelling, was the beginning. The 8 annual gatherings, the East Wall and the brown wool dress. The 7 men who had found reasons to be somewhere else, because that was where it actually started. Not on the mountain, not in the blizzard. It started in a barn on an October night with a woman who was tired of being measured by the wrong things, and who had the specific, stubborn, unglamorous courage to say yes when something real was finally offered. The mountain had tested her. She had not broken. That was the story. That was all of it.